Hello everyone, today we read and comment the ninth chapter of the third book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, its title being The Surprise. The text follows. From the subject of the foregoing chapter, the general endeavor to attain a relative superiority, there follows another endeavor which must consequently be just as general in its nature. This is the surprise of the enemy. It lies more or less at the foundation of all undertakings, for without it the preponderance at the decisive point is not properly conceivable. The surprise is, therefore, not only the means to the attainment of numerical superiority, but it is also to be regarded as a substantive principle in itself, on account of its moral effect. Then it is successful in a high degree. Confusion and broken courage in the enemy's ranks are the consequences, and of the degree to which these multiply a success there are examples enough, great and small. We are not now speaking of the particular surprise which belongs to the attack, but of the endeavor by measures generally, and especially by the distribution of forces, to surprise the enemy, which can be imagined just as well in the defensive, and which in the tactical defense particularly is a chief point. We say, surprise lies at the foundation of all undertakings without exception, only in varied degrees according to the nature of the undertaking and other circumstances. This difference indeed originates in the properties of peculiarities of the army and its commander, in those even of the government. Secrecy and rapidity are the two factors in this product, and these suppose in the government and the commander-in-chief great energy, and on the part of the army a high sense of military duty. With effeminacy and loose principles it is in vain to calculate upon a surprise, but so general indeed, so indispensable as in the endeavor, and true as it is that it is never wholly unproductive of effect, still it is not less true that it seldom succeeds to a remarkable degree. And this follows from the nature of the idea itself. We should form an erroneous conception if we believed that by these means chiefly there is much to be attained in war. In idea it promises a great deal. In the execution it generally sticks fast by the friction of the whole machine. In tactics the surprise is much more at home, for the very natural reason that all times and spaces are on a smaller scale. It will, therefore, in strategy be the more feasible in proportion as the measures lie nearer to the province of tactics, and more difficult the higher up they lie towards the province of policy. The preparations for a war usually occupy several months. The assembly of an army at its principal positions requires generally the formation of depots and magazines, and long marches, the object of which can be guessed soon enough. It therefore rarely happens that one state surprises another by a war, or by the direction which it gives the mass of its forces. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when war turned very much upon sieges, it was a frequent aim, and quite a peculiar and important chapter in the art of war, to invest a strong place unexpectedly, but even that only rarely succeeded. On the other hand, with things which can be done in a day or two, a surprise is much more conceivable, and therefore also it is often not difficult thus to gain a march upon the enemy, and thereby a position, a point of country, a road, etc. But it is evident that what surprise gains in this way in easy execution, it loses in the efficacy. As the greater the efficacy, the greater always the difficulty of execution. Whoever thinks that with such surprises on a small scale he may connect great results, as for example the gain of a battle, the capture of an important magazine, believes in something which it is certainly very possible to imagine, but for which there is no warrant in history. For there are upon the whole very few instances where anything great has resulted from such surprises, from which we may justly conclude that inherent difficulties lie in the way of their success. Certainly, whoever would consult history on such points must not depend on sundry battle steeds of historical critics, on their wise dicta and self-complacent terminology, but look at facts with his own eyes. There is, for instance, a certain day in the campaign in Silesia 1761, which in this respect has attained a kind of notoriety. It is the 22nd of July, on which Frederick the Great gained on Laudon the march to Nossen near Nice, by which, as is said, the junction of the Austrian and Russian armies in Upper Silesia became impossible, and therefore a period of 4 weeks was gained by the king. Whoever reads over this occurrence carefully in the principal histories and considers it impartially will, in the march of the 22nd of July, never find this importance, and generally in the wall of the fashionable logic on this subject he will see nothing but contradictions. But in the proceedings of Laudon, in this renowned period of maneuvers, much that is unaccountable. How could one with a thirst for truth and clear conviction accept such historical evidence? When we promise ourselves great effects in a campaign from the principle of surprising, we think upon great activity, rapid resolutions, and forced marches as the means of producing them. But these things, even when forthcoming in a very high degree, will not always produce the desired effect. We see in examples given by generals who may be allowed to have the greatest talent in the use of these means, Frederick the Great and Bonaparte. The first, when he left Dresden so suddenly in July 1760, and falling upon Lacy, then turned against Dresden, gained nothing by the wall of that intermezzo, but rather placed his affairs in a condition notably worse, as the fortress Glatz fell in the meantime. In 1813, Bonaparte turned suddenly from Dresden twice against Blücher, to say nothing of his incursion into Bohemia from Upper Lusatia, and both times without in the least attaining his object. They were blows in the air, which only cost him time and force, and might have placed him in a dangerous position in Dresden. Therefore, in this field, a surprise does not necessarily meet with great success, though through the mere activity, energy, and resolution of the commander. It must be favored by other circumstances, but by no means deny that there can be success. We do not deny there can be success. We only connect with it the necessity of favorable circumstances, which certainly do not occur very frequently, and which the commander can seldom bring about himself. Just those two generals afford each striking illustration of this. We take first Bonaparte in his famous enterprise against Blücher's army in February 1814, when it was separated from the Grand Army and descending the Marne. It would not be easy to find a 2 days' march to surprise the enemy productive of greater results than this. Blücher's army, extended over a distance of 3 days' march, was beaten in detail and suffered a loss nearly equal to that of defeat in a great battle. This was completely the effect of a surprise, for if Blücher had thought of such a near possibility of an attack from Bonaparte, he would have organized his march quite differently. To this mistake of Blücher's the result is to be attributed. Bonaparte did not know all the circumstances, and so there was a piece of good fortune that mixed itself up in his favor. It is the same with the Battle of Liegnitz, 1760. Frederick the Great gained this fine victory through altering during the night a position which he had just before taken up. Laudon was through this completely surprised and lost 70 pieces of artillery and 10,000 men. Although Frederick the Great had this time adopted the principle of moving backwards and forwards in order to make a battle impossible, or at least to disconcert the enemy's plans, still the alteration of position on the night of the 14th-15th was not made exactly with that intention, but, as the king himself says, because the position of the 14th did not please him. Here, therefore, also chance was hard at work. Without this happy conjunction of the attack and the change of position in the night, and the difficult nature of the country, the result would have not been the same. Also, in the higher and highest province of strategy, there are some instances of surprises fruitful in results. We shall one cite the brilliant marches of the great Elector against the Swedes from Franconia to Pomerania, and from the Mark Brandenburg to the Pregel in 1757, and the celebrated passage of the Alps by Bonaparte, 1800. In the latter case, an army gave up its whole theater of war by a capitulation, and in 1757 another army was very near giving up its theater of war and itself as well. Lastly, as an instances of a war wholly unexpected, we may bring forward the invasion of Silesia by Frederick the Great. Great and powerful are here the results everywhere, but such events are not common in history if we do not confuse with them cases in which a state, for want of activity and energy, Saxony 1756 and Russia 1812, has not completed its preparations in time. Now, there still remains an observation which concerns the essence of the thing. A surprise can only be effected by that party which gives the law to the other, and he who is in the right gives the law. If we surprise the adversary by a wrong measure, then instead of reaping good results, we may have to bear a sound blow in return. In any case, the adversary need not trouble himself much about our surprise. He has in our mistake the means of turning off the evil. As the offense includes in itself much more positive action than the defensive, so the surprise is certainly more in its place with the assailant, but by no means invariably, as we shall hereafter see. Mutual surprises by the offensive and defensive may therefore meet, and then that one will have the advantage who has hit the nail on the head the best. So should it be, but practical life does not keep to this line so exactly, and that for a very simple reason. The moral effects which attend a surprise often convert the worst case into a good one for decisive favor, and do not allow the other to make any regular determination. We have here in view, more than anywhere else, not only the chief commander, but each single one, because a surprise has the effect in particular of greatly loosening unity, so that the individuality of each separate leader easily comes to light. Much depends here on the general relation in which the two parties stand to each other. If the one side, through a general moral superiority, can intimidate and outdo the other, then he can make use of the surprise with more success and even reap good fruit where properly he should come to ruin. So this chapter is very important because it not just introduces surprise as a general principle in war, but also explains fundamentally where it fundamentally emerges from in the practice of the art of warfare. And we see here the omnipresent role that it really has, right? And as we have seen in previously, when trying to correct the speculations about abstract systems ideally brought to fight together to determine theoretical principle, we have pointed out many times that two armies that will be particularly asymmetric in nature at one point will unlikely clash, because that is disadvantaged would realize that situation, that condition, and would refuse to fight. So the surprise adds fundamentally this touch of possibility fundamentally to force that situation, so that the disadvantage, not knowing fundamentally about all of its disadvantage, will be more easily engageable, right, and therefore hopefully brought to ruin, right? Still in a situation that in which this happens basically from both sides at the same time, right? It's really a gnosiological problem. It's not even a problem of force, right? Even less of actual material forces, right? It has a lot even in here to do with the actual moral force that stands in here, and it has to do even with the, as we have seen now in this chapter, with the actual will to fight, right? You can surprise an enemy in this regard, not because you are apparently at advantage in a objectives, like kind of enumerable set of of quantities, right? But because fundamentally you can use the surprise in itself to create some kind of dysfunction within the enemy, which is not necessarily a precondition for victory, but in a sense always acts here, and it's one of the factors that will decide definitely the outcome in a way or another. So the surprise, von Clausewitz writes, from the subject of the foregoing chapter, the general endeavor to attain a relative superiority, there follows another endeavor which must consequently be as general in its nature. This is the surprise of the enemy. It lies more or less at the foundation of all undertakings, for without it the preponderance at the decisive point is not properly conceivable. Right? This is what we just said. Right? If you pretend to have a decisive a preponderance at the decisive point, right? A climatic point, what is going to decide more than the others, hopefully taking a turn in the world war, etc. You should essentially increase the degree of surprise. That is by how much you're going to bring on the table against the enemy. This is interesting because you see what this means is that you should concentrate, as we've seen in the previous chapter about the superiority numbers. It has also to do with the concentration of properly of material means. That means that you are essentially bringing on the fore a larger system that as a consequence is also more difficult to frame, right? And in this difficulty that has to do in fact with how much the enemy or even yourself can understand lies the attrition that eventually tends to flatten the opportunity of creating a real surprise, or better, to exploit the asymmetry. As we've seen, the problems are going to be, if there is going to be a fight anyway, largely similar, right? There are not battles in which the odds are extremely desperate, or at least there can be, but they're usually rarer. Like if you're bringing everything to the big battle, you must have consider carefully what is at stake and risk, and most of the times that condition happens because you think you can make it, right? That is not devoid of risks, of course, but it's showing balanced odds in practice. So what makes the this decisive this preponderance existing at the decisive point is at the same time probably the denial of surprise, as we will see now. So this is probably one of the finest asymptotic reasonments in the Vom Kriege that show you in fact how there is no magic card you can play out of the blue, at least in a pre-orderly fashion. Right, we'll see now examples that brought to that, but von Clausewitz says these things are rare because normally the enemy will know more or less what can happen, right, as much as you do, right, because you have been thinking about it thoroughly. And once again, the larger the system is, the more attrition there is, and the more difficult it is to do something that is generally unexpected. Von Clausewitz says the surprise is therefore not only the means to the attainment of numerical superiority, but it is also to be regarded as a substantive principle in itself on account of its moral effect. That is, there is definitely a connection, as we have seen, between this decisive point of the campaign. Decisive meant as not really decisive in absolute terms, but in this relative scenario that can evolve differently, and the surprise, right? That is where really it's as if if surprise was the higher, the effect of numerical superiority would be amplified accordingly. That is, it's the same material means, but the way you employed them, if you manage to exploit essentially the ignorance or even the stupidity of the enemy in this regard, which we all suffer in a way or another, you are going to accomplish, chiefly through a moral effect, right, a great deal of things, right? Once again, they may not be enough to win the battle, but still it will have its importance. So as we've seen, all that lays, we've seen how von Clausewitz fundamentally considers the imaginary possible scenarios as objects that have a strategical weight by themselves. That is to say, we're in war, we're always looking at what the enemy could do next, and our actions are taken, even if we don't know if that thing will happen, and we attach a certain, probability to it. We deal with them as if they could be definitely real scenarios, right? So in this regard, surprise has a lot to do with this, right? It has a lot to do with the expectability, if you want, of the action, right? And that's where the moral effect has such a big impact, because especially at the strategical level, because the whole point is bringing the enemy to fight on the field, right? If you already brought them there, and they have to fight in a way or another, and therefore the mistake is before. Right, it's in the strategical decision to get there, right? The other day we were making a video about the Battle of Bouvines, and we've seen, for example, how the Anglo-Germans arrived. They ran over into French army, and they found it already deployed unexpectedly. So that was a big deal for them, right? There was someone who had foreseen this actually, but that had an impact probably in the battle in terms of as a moral effect chiefly. And von Clausewitz explains how the thing has an effect, because when it is successful in a high degree, confusion and broken courage in the enemy's ranks are the consequences, right? So we're talking literally about both, let's say, a psychophysical impact, because not only you're caught by surprise, but this sense of surprise freezes you in a way that also invests naturally in the material side of the story. You're not behaving as speedily in the same way like you've seen before. So you can imagine in this sense even the same ranks not being, let's say suffering of the individual sense of the sum, at least of the commander of the various soldiers, as a consequence of that surprise. And von Clausewitz writes, and of the degree to which these multiply a success, there are examples enough, great and small. We're not now speaking of the particular surprise which belongs to the attack, right, but of the endeavor by measures generally, and especially by the distribution of forces, to surprise the enemy, which can be imagined just as well in the defensive, and which in the tactical defense particularly is a chief point, right? So the point here is that surprise is not meant as the general, the ambush of someone attacking, right? That it's the most probably iconic type of surprise, if you want. But as a matter of fact, the surprise can be achieved in every single situation, even in the defense. And in this regard, as we'll see, surprise has generally a greater room during the attack. But even in the defense, and especially at a tactical rather than a strategical level, surprise really has an important impact, and we'll see also why specifically. By scale, right, in a different way. By degree, let's say, better rather than scale. Then von Clausewitz says, so, first of all, this has to do with the distribution of forces properly. Yeah? Never take this out of the mind, right? It's not truly about the, how do you necessarily deploy them, how, you exploit the terrain or whatever. I mean, these are all things you can do. Right, but mostly this has to do with how many forces are actually involved in this stuff, because it's you're hiring the bet in many ways, and that's what truly has the greater impact, because the whole thing here is the moral effect, is showing the enemy how much you're willing to risk, and as a consequence, even bluffing sometimes, right? And that's also important, because as you understand, the risk is also higher, and as we've seen, that gets balanced over time, but again, it's also balanced by the same odds that make maybe this bluff less likely. So the whole thing has a sort of balance and equilibrium. And for Clausewitz, right, we say Surprise lies at the foundation of all undertakings without exception, only in very different degrees according to the nature of the undertaking and other circumstances. That is what we just said, right? That is, this is present everywhere, but still, right, it's rare to have a major imbalance from this point of view, right? It's your lives you're risking, and even more than that. So the point here is, as we were saying before, that asymmetry exists, but by definition, because war is always asymmetric by definition. There is no such thing like symmetric warfare in concrete terms, in real terms, right? It's always asymmetric. But this asymmetry also, most of the times, it's not so low. And we're not talking here about the type of troops, the journalistic terminology of symmetry that is constantly misused. You could have a good symmetry between the so-called, also horrible term, conventional warfare and, guerrilla, right? That's what the whole deal is. That guerrilla does what it does because it's exactly balancing, it's exactly growing symmetric in effectiveness to conventional armies, right? Given the conditions to do it, like even in there, it's not a magical formula. Guerrilla's been crushed so many times, it's unbelievable, but for some reason we think that that's the most, effective thing ever, right? While, once again, in absolute terms, this has no sense. The Vom Kriege explains pretty damn well why. Then von Clausewitz says this difference indeed originates. So where is this imbalance created? It originates in the properties of or peculiarities of the army and its commander, in those even of the government. So to make it simpler, it's mostly something that has to do, as always, more with the higher levels, right, at a strategical or even political, right? We have seen even, in the last chapter about the superiority numbers that, for example, the availability of certain amount of troops is fundamentally a political thing. It's not military, right? You can decide it in a strategical sense. This is usually what happens, but, if you don't have troops from home, it's not the command's fault. It's the government's fault in that regard. So what von Clausewitz is saying here, as it's obvious, is that the most important effect in absolute terms, both for the absolute difference they're going to make by scale and also by the increase of attrition, is what happens usually at a political or strategical level, right? The fact that great results are going to be achieved by surprise, for example, through tactics, it's lower than this is going to be achieved through strategy, right? It is pretty intuitive, frankly. Von Clausewitz writes, secrecy and rapidity are the two factors in this product, and these suppose in the government and the commander-in-chief great energy, and on the part of the army a high sense of military duty, right? So surprise in this sense is not a mere intellectual gain. It has a lot to do with that, but it's obviously related to much else. Moral forces in the measure of not just intellectual ones, but also properly spiritual. The morale and a particular attitude to this. We see the great energy, sense of military duty, all things we have seen in previous chapters. Therefore, Clausewitz says, with the femininity and loose principles, it is in vain to calculate upon a surprise. So this has to do, with how lax your army really is, right? And how, it's basically growing unmotivated and lazy. But so general, Clausewitz says, indeed so indispensable, as it is this endeavor, and true as it is that is never volume unproductive of effect, still it is not the less true that it seldom succeeds to a remarkable degree, right? It rarely does. And this follows from the nature of the idea itself, right? The idea is that surprise is always there, and everybody knows it, right? The idea of catching the enemy by surprise is something that the enemy is always trying to avoid, and that you're trying to avoid at the same time. So, in general, it's rare that great results are achieved through surprise, especially at a strategical level. And this has a lot to do. Actually, let's let von Clausewitz finish for us, because it says, we should form an erroneous conception if we believed that by this means chiefly there is a much to be attained in war. In idea it promises a great deal. In the execution it generally sticks fast by the friction of the whole machine. That is to say, the idea of catching the enemy by surprise is, okay, let's do it. But the point is, when we're going to implement this, is it really going to work, right? And the question here is really of crystalline mathematical coherence. It is to say, the enemy obviously knows what you could be theoretically up to, right, at all times. And obviously it allocates, it assigns a certain level of probability that this is going to happen in the first place. So the point that an enemy is going to be caught by surprise, with good effect, should be just a very asinine way of taking it tendentially, because things that are least expected are usually what is less likely to happen, right? And it is less likely to happen because we know that that thing to take place would bring to great risks, right? And an increase of the friction as a consequence that could turn this, and von Clausewitz will be very clear about this later, into a disaster for you, right? So, of course, just think about high quality troops. That in fact, von Clausewitz thus says it requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of military sense of duty, right? It's obvious that if you think about special forces, this is basically all what they're designed to do, right? But at the same time, special forces are not going to resolve a war by themselves, right? And this by scale makes you understand really what this whole thing is about. In a sheer terms of proportions, right? And von Clausewitz writes, in tactics, the surprise is much more at home. Exactly, for the very natural reason that all times and spaces are on a smaller scale. So what does this mean? It means that if you consider the strategical dimension and you see, the potential that this could have on a tactical engagement that is on a smaller scale, well, of course you can, from that strategical side, overwhelm, for example, the enemy in a given point. The point is that this is going to be a limited point, right? It's not going to be the big decisive one, because the enemy overall, at a strategical level, has taken measures to deal chiefly with the bulk of you, rather than caring about the single garrison that overall, compared to the rest of the army, is not important. That is not to say that even taking out a single garrison is not a big deal, right? Just some month ago, starting a battle in which an army basically passed unnoticed across a pass, because they managed to take out, with a feint, by the way, of movements of the strategy, this outpost, and that they passed from the other side, and the enemy army found these guys at their rear, right? And that was a freaking masterpiece, just from a strategical point of view. So this thing can happen, but the reason being, even in there, probably the enemy was, not very good at what was due, and other details suggested that it was the case. And guess what? Here we're talking still about the theory art of war proper. That is to say, the enemy can suck big times if their politics sucks, right? Mostly military failures are political failures, most of the times, paradigmatically, right? So you must be convinced as a society, as a political entity, to do that thing. They're talking about entire wars, single campaigns, even single battles, like in that case, by the way, because that's what is going to make the greater difference. And von Clausewitz has been very clear about this. Guess what? What did it just say that? Exactly. The main usually what surprises is better carried out is when there is politics in the middle, right? It's not about really a military dimension, because militarily speaking, it's also rare to find armies that fight with great differences in with great asymmetry, as we've seen in that sense, just from a tactical point of view. But from a strategical, then from a political, well, the differences evidently increase, right? So Von Clausewitz goes on and says, it will therefore in strategy be the more feasible in proportion as the measures lie nearer to the province of tactics and more difficult the higher up they lie towards the province of policy. Right, so this means what, though? The strategy can achieve a greater degree of surprise when it gets smaller, right? When things are getting down to divisional, regimental, company level, let's say, then which is already basically a tactical thing in terms of command. While in politics, of course, if there is a huge disaster, politically speaking, this can bring to achieve a greater surprise in this regard. But at the same time, it's also rarer that in policy this can happen, in the sense that, of course, you're willing to risk less. So even in that regard, the differences can be greater. In war, the way you're wiping out the enemy step by step is usually because you manage to inflict all these blows in a bigger scale, right? Wars are not won usually because you win smaller engagements. Wars are usually won because you basically manage to defeat the enemy at a broader level. But at the same time, at this broader level, given the conditions that there are, even outside the war, as just an instrument of policy, this tends to be leveled in a way, right? So that even what von Clausewitz is saying here is that at that point, probably surprise is not even going to be important because it's usually, the thing will be resolved in a different way, right? It will not probably even get to combat in that regard. And always remember that the objective of war is to compel the enemy to fulfill your will, and this is the whole deal. It's not about literally eliminating the enemy from a physical point of view. That is not what war is really about, right? That can be an ideology, can be something else, right? That politics will take care of that. You're a fanatic, totalitarian, genocidal, dictator. But the idea is that war doesn't need to do that, right? Because the enemy at that point will have surrendered by other reasons, chiefly. So von Clausewitz says that the preparations for a war usually occupy several months, and the assembly of an army at its principal positions requires generally the formation of depots and magazines, and long marches, the object of which can be guessed soon enough. Right, so this is also very important a statement for, if anything, for military historical use, right? The idea that, the enemy can achieve surprise at a strategical level, it's usually very low, right? The idea that armies attack suddenly from nowhere and then nobody could, usually in war, basically, every single power knew more or less what was going to happen, right? If there are studies that want to overstress the fact, and think about the Huns against the Roman Empire. Oh, the Huns went triple speed than every other army at the time. They caught everybody by surprise. No, they didn't catch anybody by surprise. They knew that they were coming. Right, these things were known, where people traveled, merchants knew everything in this sense. These things, war is not an isolated act. This is a Clausewitzian quote, because it's exactly what it is, right? War doesn't break out all of a sudden without any knowledge what is going to happen, right? Everything is premeditated, everything is already known, largely, and otherwise it wouldn't be war, because nobody goes to war like thinking, let's just do it from a second to another, right? It's too risky, it's too important. It doesn't happen like that, right? So it's very, very easy to spot what the enemy is going to do, even months in advance, right? You may not know where they will hit, but generally speaking, precisely, but you can see preparations quite easily. And then you can, this has very important consequences in the relation between attack and defense, as you understand. We will see that in the dedicated chapters. And von Clausewitz just makes an example that went closer to general idea of surprise achieved strategically, like in the 17th and 18th centuries, when war turned very much upon sieges, if it was a frequent aim and quite a peculiar and important chapter in the art of war to invest a strong place unexpectedly, but even that only rarely succeeded, right? So to explain this is a bit more complicated than the usual, but it has to do with the same political and social side of the situation, right? It was very difficult to find a power that had an army ready to just defend all its territory, right? The modern state was in its infancy, and usually it's just greater power. Think about Frederick. Even the example of Frederick II exists, but if you think about the army of Louis XIV, right, and the fact that the rest of Europe had all to coalesce to get in that specific place and to try to stop the French to take those then Flemish or German fortresses, right? So that's important because it shows that even though at the time it was feasible at least to attack unexpectedly, in the sense that the intention, where do you attack and how much can the enemy cover, right? Still attrition, which is what von Clausewitz said before, brought fundamentally to halt this, right? Because siege warfare was speeding up in terms of dynamism, but was still difficult, it was still complicated, and the enemy had time to gather. And after all, you see even here that there is not a dramatic asymmetry in practice, and that that's a big chapter of European warfare at the time, modern warfare. Then von Clausewitz says, on the other hand, with things which can be done in a day or two, a surprise is much more conceivable. And it's obvious that this can be achieved mostly from a tactical point of view, and therefore also it is often not difficult thus to gain a march upon the enemy, and thereby a position, a point of counter, a road, etc. But it is evident that what surprise gains in this way in easy execution, it loses in efficacy, as the greater efficacy, the greater always the difficulty of execution. Right? This is also another very important point in the logic of it, that okay, you want to surprise the enemy, but to what end, actually? Right? Because it's actually very easy to surprise people. The point is, what are you going to do about it, right? It can be just, a psychological scheme, right? You're, doing something weird that, you said, wait, what is going? But you're just buying time before essentially the enemy discovers that whatever you're up to, maybe, you don't have a better option. So that, past that initial, amazement, the enemy will simply overrun you because you don't have any other card to play. So once again, yes, you can achieve this stuff in tactically speaking, but what's the point, right? And by how many degrees you can do it. You see, well, the point here is that we're not trying to get to the idea that these surprise actions are not effective. I mean, military history is full of examples of extraordinary, even very important battles, right? Even some strategical, situations which, great, achievements were gotten through surprise. But here we're observing the likelihood, rather, of how much that can happen. And there is gap. I mean, as we have seen, there is always a good, a fairly good chance to enact surprise and one another. The point is how difficult also it is to really achieve it, to really carry that out. That is an important question, and most of the times it may not be even convenient, right? Leaving aside that, of course, if the situation is desperate, there is also greater pressure on you. So that military virtue, that energy, and that sense of duty could be boosted, right? So that for you to make you obtain that result. So that in that degree, it's also very important. Not much. Yes, properly the surprise, right? But at the same time, this becomes rarer the more we rise in the scale, because as we have seen, the strategical feats in this sense are more difficult by surprise than the tactical ones, and simply because there is a greater attrition, right? So you can theoretically get through the enemy lines more easily, at a tactical level than you can at a strategical level. Right? This is quite evident, self-evident. For Clausewitz goes on and says, whoever thinks that with such surprises on a small scale he may connect great results, as for example the gain of a battle, the capture of an important magazine, believes in something which is certainly very possible to imagine, but for which there is no warrant in history, right? For there are upon the whole very few instances where anything great has resulted from such surprises, from which we may justly conclude that the inherent difficulties lie in the way of their success. In other words, the greatest results are exactly the ones that are most difficult to achieve, and therefore things tend to mediocrity, right? Also for reasons that are not just, probabilistic, right? Things tend to get disorderly, right? You can't take an army keep an army on the field forever. You can't use the same person forever. You as a soldier, for years. You can't you can't think that the enemy is so stupid that you're at the point has not thought of something that for you it's so evident, has not that is so easy to do, and that he has not done anything to prevent, right? It's obvious, of course, that there is always a certain amount of risk, right? That war, as we've seen from the Vom Kriege, cannot be fought without risk. That is, what happens in war is always potentially, in conditions which you can die in the most stupid way, after all, right? The point is that you're in the same condition of the enemy, so it's in this vacuum, if you want, of possibilities that lies really the capability, the perseverance, and you must really be very determined, very skilled and energetic in order to achieve results through that way, right? But it's not easy. So once again, there's no way out. Either you're prepared to suffer, or you will not achieve a great much. The same is true in life in general. Then von Clausewitz passes to specific historical examples and writes, certainly whoever would consult history in such points must not depend on sundry battle steeds of historical critics, on their wise dicta and self-complacent terminology, but look at the facts with his own eyes, right? This is a memento that is always valid, that is, never take a statement, as true until you have checked yourself. That is, in life, we can be competent of very, very few amount of things, and that once or times we trust in people that, however, if we want to be very spot on, they wouldn't at least make us understand what's the real point until, unless we go see whether what they're talking about is true or not. And von Clausewitz writes, there is, for instance, a certain day in the campaign in Silesia 1761, which in this respect has attained a kind of notoriety. It is the 22nd of July, in which Frederick the Great gained on Loudun the march to Nossen near Nice, by which, as is said, the junction of the Austrian and Russian armies in Upper Silesia became impossible, and therefore a period of 4 weeks was gained by the king. Whoever reads over this occurrence carefully in the principal histories of the time and consider this impartially will, in the March of July the 22nd, never find this importance. And generally, in the wall of the fashionable logic of this subject, he will see nothing but contradictions. But in the proceedings of Loudun, in this renowned period of maneuvers, much that is unaccountable. How could one with a thirst for truth and clear conviction accept such historical evidence? Right. So, if understood clearly, this has to do with the fact that the impossibility of maneuvering, that is to say, that the historians that dealt before von Clausewitz in time with this event didn't understand that Frederick the Great's maneuver and this bit of march was aimed at separating the Austrian and the Russian armies for a conjunction. It was just seen as a kind of volition that was fashionable, this concentration, emphasis on movements and marches, counter marches at the time. So they missed the entire strategical point. That is, the King of Prussia was able to prevent the conjunction of the two armies by surprise, right? And therefore achieving a feat that in that situation was partially, unforeseen, or at least was considered unlikely, and that's when one of the greatest generals of his times managed to obtain, right? To actually achieve anyway. Then Von Clausewitz says, when we promise ourselves great effects in a campaign from the principle of surprising, we think upon a great activity, rapid resolutions, and forced marches as the means of producing them. But that these things, even when forthcoming in a very high degree, will not always produce the desired effect, we see in examples given by generals who may be allowed to have had the greatest talent in the use of these means, Frederick the Great and Bonaparte. The first, when he left Dresden so suddenly in July 1760 and falling upon Lachey, then turned against Dresden, gained nothing by the wall of that intermezzo, but rather placed his affairs in a condition notably worse, as the fortress of glass fell in the meantime. Right. So, for example, in this occasion, Frederick caught the enemy by surprise, but still, didn't achieve anything great, and on the contrary, actually put himself to risk, as things could have gone, dramatically worse while his, objective basically failed. Then, von Clausewitz writes, in 1813, Bonaparte turned suddenly from Dresden twice against Blücher, right? To say nothing of his incursion into Bohemia from Upper Lusatia, and both times without in the least attaining his object. They were blows in the air which only cost him time and force, and might have placed him in a dangerous position at Dresden. So basically the same thing, right? Even close to the same city. And then von Clausewitz writes, therefore, even in this field, a surprise does not necessarily meet with great success through the mere activity, energy, and resolution of the commander. Because, both Frederick the Great and Napoleon here displayed great activity, energy, resolution, but still they didn't accomplish anything. And they were Frederick the Great and Napoleon, right? So, von Clausewitz writes, it must be favored by other circumstances, but we by no means deny that there can be success. We only connect with it a necessity of favorable circumstances which certainly do not occur very frequently, and which the commander can seldom bring about himself. So this whole thing means that, those chances in which you can't really do something through surprise are rare, and or generally speaking, they tend to be risky after all, right? In terms of an actual balance of costs benefits, right? Risk, let's say, in insight. And so Clausewitz goes on and says, just those two generals afford each a striking illustration of this. We take first Bonaparte in his famous enterprise against Blücher's army in February 1814, when it was separated from the Grand Army and descending the Marne. It would not be easy to find a 2 days' march to surprise the enemy productive of greater results than this. Blücher's army, extended over a distance of 3 days' march, was beaten in detail and suffered a loss nearly equal to that of defeat in a great battle. This was completely the effect of a surprise, for if Blücher had thought of such a near possibility of an attack from Bonaparte, he would have organized his march quite differently. To this mistake of Blücher's the result is to be attributed. Bonaparte did not know all the circumstances, and so there was a piece of good fortune that mixed itself up in his favor. So this is very interesting because this thing happened relatively randomly. Right? This is not properly even Napoleon thinking to achieve this much, right? He was lucky enough that Blücher, whose fault brought to this lack of care, to the fact that he had not foreseen that Napoleon could counter march against him, had its army destroyed before he could even assemble, right? Therefore, basically getting defeated at the scale, even a major clash, so a disaster. And this also shows actually the problems that can arise even in the higher ranks. Actually a very good commander like Blücher, that can happen when there is a mistake, right? Or there are certain situations in a commander's mind that can bring to this, I don't know how to define in this case, but it's still a fault, right? That spoiled the situations, it brings to disaster. Then von Clausewitz says, it is the same with the Battle of Liegnitz, 1760. Frederick the Great gained this fine victory through altering during the night a position which he had just before taken up. Laudon was through this completely surprised and lost 70 pieces of artillery and 10,000 men. Although Frederick the Great had this time adopted the principle of moving backwards and forwards in order to make battle impossible, or at least to disconcert the enemy's plans, still the alteration of position on the night of the 14th-15th was not made exactly with that intention, but as the king himself says, because the position of the 14th did not please him. So this is interesting because it addresses one thing that we talked about before, that is this, for example, making back and forth with the army. That is not really a great thing, but maybe it's aimed at wearing, confusing, tiring more easily an army that is more going to suffer more of this maneuvers than yours in the meanwhile, so you buy time, right? It's not a much of a great deal, but it can be done. This wasn't even the point at Liegnitz, because basically what Frederick did here was basically he was bothered by the position he had taken the day before, so during the night he shifted the camp chiefly for that reason. So even with the idea of actually meeting the enemy, probably in kind of a, the point is that his own position is what disturbed him, not properly what the enemy would have thought of it, and instead he managed basically to annihilate the enemy army, in just because he was caught by surprise, even indirectly, right? And this can happen in this sense, so that you always have to take in consideration that surprise sometimes actually happens at every single moment in war, exactly because it produces itself also, and very often, and more often probably than what you can plan, by itself. So this is really a very important lesson. That von Clausewitz says, also in the higher and highest province of strategy, there are some instances of we had a last phrase here from the paragraph. Here, therefore, also chance was hard at work. Without this happy conjunction of the attack and the chance of position in the night, and the difficult nature of the country, the result would have not been the same. So, fairly random. Then he goes on and says, also in the higher and highest province of strategy, there are some instances of surprises fruitful in results. Right? It's more difficult, but it can happen. We shall only cite the brilliant marches of the great Elector against the Swedes from Franconia to Pomerania, from the Mark, Brandenburg, to the Pregel in 1757, and the celebrated passage of the Alps by Bonaparte, 1800. In the latter case, an army gave up his whole theater of war by a capitulation in 1757. Another army was very near giving up its theater of war in itself as well. Lastly, as an instance of a war wholly unexpected, we may bring forward the invasion of Silesia by Frederick the Great. Great and powerful are here the results everywhere, but such events are not common in history if we do not confuse with them cases in which a state, for want of activity and energy, Saxony 1756 and Russia 1812, had not completed its preparations in time. So even in here, as you see, the greater, surprise tactically can be achieved mostly from repulsive strategy and strategy for repulsive politics. It's rarer, but potentially can be more disruptive. I mean, look at, I don't know, the Eastern Front in World War II. Like, it's not, I mean, of course the Soviets were preparing to, actually, if you really look at their deployment on the front today, on the West, they were deployed really for attacks. So in there, we'll have to study that thing. The idea is that they were unprepared in general. There was some, doctrinal problem, strategical problem in general. But the point here there is that there were also other systemic structural elements, right, that played in their favor. But think about how much in this regard, and this is exactly the point, it was achievable by Operation Barbarossa in the first stages, just because not of just much of a military problem of the Soviet Union, but because of its political and social condition overall, right? So it was a surprise that in that regard had much deeper roots than merely how they employ their armored forces. And the same can be said in many other contexts. So the preparation proper has a great significance. Then von Clausewitz says, now there still remains an observation which concerns the essence of the thing. A surprise can only be effected by that party which gives the law to the other, and he who is in the right gives the law. If we surprise the adversary by a wrong measure, then instead of reaping good results, we may have to bear a sound blow in return. In any case, the adversary need not trouble himself much about our surprise. He has in our mistake the means of turning off the evil. So you see what can happen here is that surprise by itself doesn't mean anything. You have to contextualize it in the field that is gonna have a consequence that is favorable to you. Otherwise, yeah, you can surprise the enemy, but this may even be worse for you in certain situations. You don't know what reaction he may trigger, and you don't know whether you would be surprised in turn. And also it's easy to of course to find an enemy, to catch an enemy by surprise, and seeing him doing something that will even increase its difficulty in that regard. Even if they're trying, for example, to catch you by surprise, and you see that they're doing it wrong, you just let them do, and then you will eventually be able to exploit it, right? Then von Clausewitz writes, as the offensive includes in itself much more positive action than the defensive, so the surprise is certainly more in its place with the assailant, but by no means invariably, as we shall hereafter see. So attack and defense are two substantially different things, right? They have a different balance, they have a different essence, there are different dynamics within them. And one of these has to do with the fact that, of course, the attack contains in itself a greater option for taking the enemy by surprise than defense, right? Because defense is passive, so you can't surprise, as we have seen, the enemy by defense, in defense, but on your defense, but still, it's more likely to be taken by surprise by an attack, right? And von Clausewitz says mutual surprises by defensive and defensive may therefore meet, as we have seen before. Surprise is present all the time, all the given time, every single action, from one side and the other. And then that one will have the advantage which has hit the nail on the head the best. So what makes the difference is not, once again, surprise by itself, but once again the context of the whole thing. So von Clausewitz says, so should be, but practical life does not keep to this line so exactly, and that for a very simple reason. The moral ethics which attend a surprise often convert the worst case into a good one, for the side they favor, and do not allow the other to make any regular determination. That is to say, you can't exploit this as if you can pretend you can always catch the enemy by surprise. It's usually not going to happen. And if you're trying to force the hand in that regard, you're either putting yourself in trouble, just convincing yourself that the enemy is in a way that it's really not. So it's basically the same thing. Then von Clausewitz says, we have here in view, more than anywhere else, not only the chief commander, but each single one, because a surprise has the effect in particular of greatly loosening unity, so that the individuality of each separate leader easily comes to light. Right? This is important. I mean, the idea that a surprise naturally highlights the the capabilities of reaction that are normally required to a commander. That is, not to lose control, to know exactly what to go on in the first place with what he's doing anyway. I mean, within the limits of what he's trying, what is happening in general. I mean, the surprise, as we've seen, can be wanted by the enemy, can be random. So you still have to sort it out, but still, this is the moment in which those who are better fitted for command can show the greater quality, right? Resilience, determination, clarity of vision, right? So, in other words, dealing suddenly with a difficult scenario that you still have to sort out, but managing to do it well in the essentials at the moment, right? This is, and von Clausewitz concludes by saying, much depends here on the general relation in which the two parties stand to each other, right? So you can't, once again, think that surprise is something that you can achieve independently from the conditions in, not only in which you are and the enemy is, but in the condition you both are relatively to each other, because that's where the possibility of achieving a surprise actually lay, right? And that also tells you, as we have seen, that most of the times this is not possible, because most of the times you are with the enemy at fairly level, fairly balanced odds. So von Clausewitz says, if the one side, through a general moral superiority, can intimidate and outdo the other, then he can make use of the surprise with more success and even reap good fruit where probably he should come to ruin. And once again here, von Clausewitz stresses the importance of the moral impact of the moral dimension of the clash, but of combat, but properly of the same the moral effect the surprise can have on someone who is predisposed already to to fail in a way. I mean, not properly so, but you understand what I mean. I mean, of course, even in desperate situations, you can sometimes surprise is that extra thing that, far by being decisive by itself, it's still what is the tip of the iceberg that you need to be just above the water surface to say, okay, we can't breathe now. But it rests on an enormous base that is often overlooked, right? And once again, this is what is often, in fact, overlooked, even when considering what tactics are, what individuals do. I mean, it's never about the material, superficial, singular thing that makes the difference overall, right? It can't do in terms of in terms of waves, right? But still, these waves propagate into something that, if it is not in that way, can render this change in influence, right? So it's not a matter of stemming, the gaps in just individually, but making the whole thing more existent in the first place, right? Because you can't. It doesn't even make sense to try to change the detail, right? If you haven't consolidated the bulk of this all. So this is really the point here. And this is a very fluid, beautiful, and clear chapter that really, I mean, these are all amazing, frankly, but these have definitely a lot of of weight in making understand how realistically we should be thinking about such eventualities, right? And the conclusion is, of course, that you have to basically stay open for everything all the time, because you're always going to be caught by surprise, and you at the moment you don't know how bad it is going to be, right? But anyhow, all right. So next time, what is here? Strategy, chapter 10. Very interesting. We stop it here for now, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.